zurückhalten und eben dich versiehst, bist du wieder gesund.
Vielen Dank. Vielen herzlichen Dank.
diese Frankensteine erschaffen. Suche die Einzelteile des Anzugs und führe die Sisters.
Schätzchen, bist du da? Rühr sie nicht an!
Verdammt nochmal, die Big Daddy-Stiefel sollen hierher geliefert werden und nicht in die verdammte Bibliothek. Was für Vollidioten lässt Ryan eigentlich für sich arbeiten? So eine Scheiße ist unter Fontaine nie passiert. Fontaine, dieser Hurensohn, macht einem Angst. Aber Ryan ist dafür ein geiziges Arschloch. Man kann den Schutzanzug nicht wiederverwenden. Mensch, Hauttransplantat und Organe. Alles kommt direkt in den Anzug, sonst funktioniert er nicht. Ryan sagt, Big Daddies sind zu teuer. Ryan kann mich mal. Diese Big Daddies stinken furchterregend. Vielleicht könnte man das ändern. Aber die Little Sisters scheinen diesen Geruch zu mögen. Jetzt brauchen wir Rekruten. Wenn du ein Big Daddy wirst, gibt es keinen Weg mehr zurück. Aber Ryan sagt, keine Sorge, Rekruten finden ist kein Problem. Dieser Ryan ist ein guter Mann.
Habe ich etwa einen Fehler gemacht? Man kann keine Städte errichten, wenn man von Zweifeln beherrscht wird. Aber kann man als Regent absolut fehlerlos sein? Ich weiß, dass meine Überzeugungen mich über die Masse stellen. Und ich weiß auch, dass die Dinge, die ich verworfen habe, mein Untergang gewesen wären. Aber die Stadt, sie zerfällt vor meinen Augen. Bin ich vielleicht so sehr von meinen eigenen Überzeugungen geblendet, dass ich die Realität nicht mehr erkenne? Mag sein. Aber Atlas ist da draußen und er beabsichtigt, mich und meine Stadt zu vernichten. Zweifeln bedeutet aufgeben. Ich werde nicht zweifeln.
Willst du...
Krieg ist schrecklich. Die Japaner haben jeden Einzelnen in meiner Stadt umgebracht, außer Souchong. Souchong hatte Opium. Sehr gutes Opium. Dieser Krieg hier ist zwar auch schrecklich, aber nicht für Souchong. Jeder hat Angst. Jeder braucht Adam. Mehr als die Little Sisters produzieren können. Das Gute am Krieg ist, dass es viele Leichen gibt. Souchong weiß nämlich, wie man aus Leichen das Adam zurückgewinnt. Aber ich kann die Little Sisters nicht ohne Schutz auf die Straße schicken. Souchong muss darüber nachdenken.
Hier findest du den Anzug.
Andrew Ryan sagt, die Menschen treffen Entscheidungen. Aber am Ende sind es unsere Entscheidungen, die uns ausmachen.
Ich gebe zu, dass es vorausschauend von Fontaine war, das Plasmidgeschäft aufzuziehen. Aber der Mann hat noch nie was vom Vertrieb verstanden. Da hat er schon diese wunderbaren kleinen Mädchen Und er zeigt sie nicht. Ich habe mir gerade das neue Design der Plasmidautomaten angesehen. Sie sind genau so geworden, wie ich sie mir vorgestellt habe. Ich sage es ganz deutlich, wenn sie gut präsentiert werden, sind diese Little Sisters Gold wert.
Schacht der Little Sisters bei den Proving Grounds.
Raptor gehört jetzt mir. Und ich verfüge über das Adam. Du glaubst doch nicht etwa, dass ich ab und zu eine Blechachtung habe, oder?
Versteck locken, dann werden sie dir die Tür öffnen. Los jetzt, schlag mit der Rohrzange auf den Lüftungsschacht. Und bitte, es ist mir sehr wichtig, dass du mit den Kleinen behutsam umgehst. Ach, meine kleinen Männchen. Aber du musst ihr Beschützer sein.
Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles!
Das war's, Kleiner. Es war ein langer Weg. Aber du erinnerst dich an das meiste ja sowieso nicht mehr. Ich habe dich als kleines Kind in ein Buch gesetzt.
Dann gehen wir! Ich bin soweit. Ich bin soweit. Bubbles.
Sich reingelegt. Oh, meine arme Moira. Oh, mein kleines Baby Patrick. Vielleicht
Ich bin
legen wir eines
soweit.
Tages wirklich eine Familie zu. Dann kann man euch Blödmänner besser verarschen.
Also bereits schon sehr lange.
Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles.
Ich hab sie nicht angepasst. Nein!
Komm, gehen wir.
Komm zurück! Ich hab's nicht so gemeint! Scheißdreck!
Ich bin soweit. Komm, Mr. Bubbles. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Sieh mal, Mr. Bubbles. Adam.
Obwohl sie
Komm,
eigentlich
gehen
von
wir.
diesem Sammelzwang
Das
befreit
war ein
sind,
schöner
bringt
Engel,
Souchons
Mr. B.
mentale Manipulation sie dazu, mit ihrer schrecklichen Tätigkeit weiterzumachen. Sünde wie diese kann kein Mensch wieder gut machen.
Als ob er kann. Ich bin soweit. Ich sehe Adam, Mr. B. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Du hast sie ganz gestohlen.
Beibringen!
Mr. B. Komm, gehen wir. Sieht traurig aus, Mr. B. Ich bin soweit. Besonders. Ich bin soweit. Ich sehe Adam, Mr. B. Du hast sie ganz gestohlen. Komm, Mr. Bubbles. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Komm, Mr. Bubbles. Ich bin soweit. Ich bin soweit. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Mr. B.
Die Ernte wird bestimmt die Slicer herlocken.
Es macht euch zu was ganz Besonderem.
Du bist ein normaler.
Ädensammeln ist... Geh hier! Ich sehe Äden, Mr. B.
Was ist hier was?
Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin ein braves Mädchen. Ich bin soweit! Komm, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin soweit! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles!
Du musst die Kleinen beschützen. Sie sind nicht mehr von Adam durchsetzt und sind daher genauso verwundbar wie normale Kinder. Wenn eine der Kleinen fällt, kannst du an einem Lüftungsschacht eine andere.
Der Engel ist voll mit Adam! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin ein braves Mädchen, Mr. B. Fuchs, du hast die ganz gestohlen. Komm, geh hier! Ädensammeln ist Ich bin soweit! Das war ein schöner Engel, Mr. B. Komm, Mr. Bubbles! Er sieht traurig aus, Mr. B. Ich sehe Adam, Mr. B. Ich bin soweit! Fuchs, du hast die reingestohlen. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin soweit! Mr. Bubbles! Komm, Mr. Bubbles! Komm, Mr. Bubbles!
Hören Sie nicht auf die Lügen von Atlas und seinen Parasiten.
Komm, gehen wir! Gehen wir, Mr. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Komm, gehen wir!
harte Rechnungen zu bezahlen. Die Versuchung, sich trotz der Ausgangssperre etwas Ähnliches zu besorgen, ist
Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles.
aber ein Verstoß gegen die Ausgangssperre ist
Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Komm, Mr. Bubbles. Ich bin soweit. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Komm, gehen wir. Ich bin soweit.
Stopp wieder voll!
Komm, Mr. Bubbles. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Ich bin soweit. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles. Ich bin ein braves Mädchen. Komm, gehen wir! Warum hast du mich gestresst? Er sieht traurig aus, Mr. B. Ich bin soweit!
Halt deine Scheißfresse!
Komm, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin soweit! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin soweit! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Hilfe! Hilfe! Es tut mir weh! Es tut mir weh! Komm, Mr. Bubbles! Gehen wir, Mr.
Die
Bubbles!
Mädchen bleiben besser bei dir. Lieber bei dir, als allein in der aufziehenden Dunkelheit.
Komm, gehen wir! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Gehen wir, Mr. Bubbles! Ich bin soweit!
Mit der Dose wäre vielleicht ein normaler Arbeiter zufrieden oder so ein Bürohengst. Aber ich brauche mehr, mehr, mehr. Ich will mich so lange fleißen, bis nichts mehr da ist.
Da, du musst die Nadel der Little Sister benutzen, um Fontaine sein Adam herauszusaugen. Das ist der einzige Weg, ihn zu besiegen.
Liegt auf die Lügen von Atlas und seinen Parasiten. Blackjack liegt auf.
Jetzt ist es nicht mehr weit. Fontaine ist ganz in der Nähe.
Worauf wartest du? Nimm die Nadel!
Willkommen im Zirkus der Werte. Komm,
Versichere dich, dass du bereit bist, ihm gegenüberzutreten, bevor du weitergehst.
Ich kann mich noch erinnern, wie diese Frau und ich dich in das U-Boot gesetzt und dich nach oben geschickt haben. Da warst du höchstens 2 Jahre alt. Ja, du warst mein Ass im Ärmel. Aber du warst für mich auch fast sowas wie ein Sohn. Und deswegen schmerzt es jetzt. Verrat, Kleiner. Manches im Leben tut einfach weh.
Ich habe dich erschaffen lassen. Ich habe dich an die Oberfläche geschickt. Ich habe dich zurückgeholt und dir gezeigt, was du bist und was du kannst. Sogar das Leben, an das du dich zu erinnern glaubst, ist etwas, das ich mir ausgedacht und dir in den Kopf tätowiert habe.
Man hat dir die ganze Stadt angeboten. Und du hast sie abgelehnt. Und was hast du stattdessen gemacht? Das, was ich von dir erwartet habe. Du hast sie gerettet. Du hast ihnen das eine gegeben, das man ihnen weggenommen hatte. Eine Chance. Die Chance zu lernen. Die Chance, Liebe zu finden. Zu leben. Und was war am Ende deine Belohnung für alles? Du hast es nie erzählt. Aber ich glaube, ich weiß es. Eine Familie.
Bioshock was groundbreaking in many regards when it released in 2007, though fundamentally it shared many consistencies with Irrational's System Shock series. What elements of System Shock translated into Bioshock, and what was refined, altered, and innovated upon to create the world of Rapture? Let's take a look at the long road from System Shock to Bioshock.
Everyone knows where the game ended up, but I think fans would be interested to learn where this game or the idea of doing this game started. And I think, you know, folks know System Shock and the legacy of that game, huge fan base. Did it start as a System Shock game initially?
No, I mean, because we didn't have the rights to that, right? We kind of felt that there was more game design to mine there. You know, that it was sort of, we did that one game, and it was sort of the first game that really combined shooting and RPG. And it was a very small budget. You know, it was a very small team, and it was the first game we had ever done. So we got pretty lucky, I think, in terms of how well it came out. But but the odds were sort of stacked against it. And the team, was really enthusiastic about doing a game like that. And time had evolved, and the team was much more. We had done a bunch of games together, and we were, we had a stable technology base, and we were like, okay, well, which System Shock 2 was not. I mean, that engine, no game had ever shipped on that engine. It was a very crude piece of technology. Most of us had never shipped a game at the time. So like, well, what if we had a stable technology base, and we had a team that was more experienced and more seasoned, and we had, an actual, like our director, and which we didn't really have on System Shock 2. What could we do? And so I think there was a lot of enthusiasm in the team to really try to do a more mature version of that kind of game. This is before we had sold the company to Take-Two, and we were an independent developer, right? We were sitting there, we were using the money we made from other development deals we had, and we would try to scrape together whatever time and money we had to work on this thing. And it was not actually something I was particularly keen on doing. The team was much more keen on doing a sort of a System Shock-ish game than I was, because...
That's what you were pitching, right? Like System Shock 3 at one point, right?
Well, I mean, there was an actual System Shock 3 that we were pitching back in the day when we were right after System Shock 2, but that never happened. Right, we couldn't get anybody interested, because System Shock 2 sold like 5 copies, right? And so as the business guy, the guy who had to not only just sort of write the content, but the guy who had to go out and get the deals and pay everybody, I wasn't particularly excited about doing this, because it was very disappointing when we did System Shock 2 and nobody bought it. It got great reviews, it got these insane reviews, but it left us in a place where it didn't really move the needle for us in terms of making payroll. So I wasn't super excited about it, because I didn't see a publisher be interested in it, and I didn't see the audience actually be particularly interested in this kind of game. And it was really the team who convinced me to invest in this, because they're enthusiastic. I think a lot of them came to the studio because of System Shock 2. And so finally they sort of battered me down. And it's good they did, because I was not the first fan of doing this.
And I know initially there was something called the Serene Dawn. That was a spaceship, or what was that?
No, that was
the name of a cult, right?
Cult. Yeah. That's right. Okay.
That one's, I think, been lost to the... If I remember correctly, Serene Dawn was a cult. You were playing as a deprogrammer that was infiltrating the cult, and your name happened to be Carlos Coelho, who was one of our programmers at the time.
It's named after him, yeah. Then there was a story notion that I always really found interesting, which was that you have these cults, and you have sometimes people who, they're these sort of characters who really live on the edge of the gray morality, which is these guys who come in and essentially kidnap people out of these cults, or rescue them, depending on how you look at it. Because what it really is, from a functional standpoint, it's a kidnapping, right? You're coming to an adult, and you're saying, you're hired by their parents or whoever, and this was in the story, it was like a senator whose daughter joined one of these religious movements called the Serene Dawn, you said?
Yeah,
Serene Dawn. And I always thought that was a really interesting tension of this hero who's basically a kidnapper. And taking a young woman against her will out of the place that she was in. Now, you could also make the other argument that, well, she was not really there by her will. But there's a really interesting conversation that goes on there. I think there was actually a Kate Winslet movie, a Harvey Keitel Kate Winslet movie, which dealt with a similar theme. Because usually you hear that story, you know, these deprogrammers as a sort of heroic kind of notion. But I always thought that, well, there's something interesting about agency going on there, and about are people entitled to make bad mistakes, or is it a bad mistake? It all depends on the person. And I'm not a fan of religious cults or religion in general, but there seemed to be an interesting discussion of freedom there and independent decision making, and I thought that idea was cool, and that was sort of the basis of it for a while. But it was really mostly for the purpose of we needed something to go out and pitch to publishers, and so we know we didn't have a ton of time to really develop it. So that sounded like, all right, this will do for now.
And was that pre-Underwater City? I mean, this was just like an idea for a story?
We may have stepped away from that to do the cult thing, but then we went back to the underwater thing.
We had that one room, remember?
We had the one World War II room with the roaches on the ground and like these weird test tube things that you could walk around. I don't know where that fell. It could have been underwater. There was no windows.
The thing is, we were a small business, right? And we were trying to like figure out a way to sell this thing with spending the least amount of money, because we didn't have any money. We didn't have a pot to piss in. So we would do this demo. That was one room basically, just to show. And I'd write up a document, and we'd take it around. I'd fly around the country, be like, "Here's our room." It was a different time, you know. And
we had just come off of SWAT 4. One of the advantages we had is that we were so familiar with that engine at that point that we could really start cranking through, small rooms and lighting and making things look good. So
I took it on the road to sell it to somebody, and nobody cared. We'd go to a publisher, and look, they have to make money, right? And then we'd say, we say, oh, it's sort of a spiritual successor to System Shock 2, and they'd be like, well, how did that sell? And I'd be like, my mom likes it, and they would be like, well, we can't, and usually we'd be talking to a fan. A lot of executives, like sort of junior executives, were fans of System Shock, and they go to their boss and they'd be super excited, and their boss would open up, their Excel spreadsheet and be like, "No, we can't do this." And I think the pitch probably evolved as we kept trying different permutations trying to sell. But we're also out there trying to sell like 2 or 3 other things at the time. We had a pitch for a game called Monster Island, and
well, our SWAT 5 pitch was
Zombie SWAT.
Yeah, we had just come off of SWAT 4, which is like hardcore tactical, and we decided they wanted us to do another SWAT, and we didn't really want to do another hardcore tactical game, so we're like, what if we added zombies to SWAT? Like, you're a SWAT team that fights zombies and werewolves. That sounds awesome. And it was like, no, it doesn't.
And this is before, before zombies were a thing.
Yeah.
And so we came with this thing called Division 9.
Division 9, yeah.
That probably would have been even a bigger financial success than Bioshock.
Wow.
But we couldn't get anybody interested in it.
We didn't have enough werewolves in the demo, I think.
We had 0 werewolves in the demo. Yeah, we were going to have werewolves, weren't we?
Werewolves and vampires. So it was
oh, really?
Yeah,
werewolves,
the whole,
vampires,
like,
zombies?
just throw it all the Universal Studios monsters from like...
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what happened was we couldn't sell it, but we were always sort of independent-minded. And so I said, well, what if we sort of did this in reverse? Instead of getting a publisher first and then doing a press tour on it, what if we sort of did the press first?
Yeah.
And we called up a guy, Andrew Park, who's at GameSpot at the time, who was a fan of System Shock 2 and a great guy. And I said, well, will you come out and look at this thing we're doing and write a story on it? And he was like, sure. And Andrew flew out, and we showed him what we had, which is this very, very rudimentary thing about an underwater base. And he wrote up an article and sort of featured as that this is the spiritual successor to System Shock 2. And the next day, the phone started ringing from publishers who now all of a sudden saw the article was getting all this pickup and all these comments, and people were excited. And that really, I think, put it over the top in terms of being able to sell it, even though it was not Bioshock at that point. It was called Bioshock, but it was not Bioshock. There would have been I don't think there would have been a game. We never would have sold it without Andrew coming out doing that.
My belly's full of angel's blood.
Nailing the perfect marriage of story to gameplay is a science that many developers still struggle with today. Bioshock has left an indelible mark on gaming narrative that can be seen and felt in many modern releases, but Irrational's motto remained from the beginning, don't start with the story, start with the gameplay.
A lot of fans probably wonder about the process you go through in writing the story and the design for a game like Bioshock. You've talked about how it evolves over time and what eventually ships is very different than your initial vision. Do you guys write like a script or a design document for the game and that becomes sort of the Bible that everyone drives towards, or do you iterate much more?
It's different for every game. Like System Shock 2, I went back to it recently. I wrote a design document, and we started that project in September, and the design document I saw was dated like October or something. So in a month, I wrote the design document, and it didn't change. A lot of it, got expanded upon, but the basic design really didn't change on that. Where on Bioshock, I think it evolved in real time much more. We had a pretty substantial design shift, like a year before the ship date.
For Bioshock?
Bioshock, yeah. It got to be much more about the experience of being in Rapture than about being in your character sheet. And so the game evolved more towards that experiential kind of thing and making sure every idea was expressed in the world as well as just on your character sheet. So before you'd have a lot of things like, oh, I'm doing fire damage or electrical damage, but that was sort of a number flying off ahead versus, the whole notion of there's barrels and you light them on fire and then you can pick them up and throw them.
But you'd have stats coming off characters and all that stuff?
Much more so.
Oh, really?
And that evolved, we did a design shift, but I don't know how well that got documented. I think we were moving so fast that we were just sort of changing things, laying down the tracks as we went right ahead of us. And the same with the screenplay, the screenplay there is no screenplay. It's a bunch of probably Excel files and fragments of Word documents that I'd write, and I'd go to recording sessions and I'd rewrite on the fly once I hear the actor perform, because once the actor takes on it, you listen to their voice and you say, what you wrote doesn't really matter. What is the right thing for this actor playing this role to be saying? So I tend to do a lot of rewriting in the session, and then you have a bug late at night where somebody says, oh, this doesn't make any sense, and you're like, oh God, and you have to write a new audio log and try to get the actor back in, or you figure out what's the best way to get this idea across? Yeah. And is it an audio log? Is it a poster on the wall? Is it a piece of text that pops up on the screen? That's always dependent on how much time you have and what actor availability is. So, the plans sort of fall apart. I think we've worked on that a bunch since on the new project we're working on, where we are trying to document things a lot better and keep things a lot more logical, but the train was running so fast on Bioshock that we just sort of...
early on, we got the Andrew Ryan scene in, like we'd said before, and that was kind of like the keystone. We're going to put a lot of work into this, so this can't change. Everything that happens before or after that don't really involve a lot of departments working together to make a scene, those things are very malleable, and if you need to change audio logs to represent a story, if you need to add lines or take away lines, that's very doable. And I think for a while we even had text-to-speech.
We even did that, I remember for Infinite with Booker and Elizabeth and other dialogue, and that really didn't work very well, because you'd have these dramatic scenes, and it'd be like, Elizabeth, we need to go to Comstock, and it just... Yeah. It almost had no value as far as I was concerned.
Atlas radio down ahead says you were looking for an invite to the fisheries. Nuts, I say. But if you heads up to the Wharf Master's office and find old Peach on research camera, maybe I could manage an invite.
Ken has so much of, these games in his head, and you're sort of, you can keep it all straight, or try to, with all the different things and changes. But from the team perspective, Sean, because this is evolving and Ken's thinking in his head about how this all ties together, how does the team sort of keep up with, what the whole game is going to look like?
There's a lot of specifics that can change. For instance, Atlas used to have a Southern drawl. Right. And then, we recast to the Irish.
And we actually cast an actor, wrote the lines, did the whole thing, and realized that people hated that character and distrusted him from the first start. So we had to rewrite him, recast him, redo everything.
Yeah. From a team perspective, you kind of get a sense on which things are going to be really volatile and that you probably want to push off till later, because if you work on it now, it might change. Larger themes don't tend to change too much, meaning we knew we were in Rapture, we knew we had Big Daddies, we knew we had Little Sisters, we knew we had Splicers, we knew what the arc of the story was about Jack coming into Rapture, and the specifics of this radiolog versus that radiolog didn't really affect anyone outside the audio team at that time, because we could still build the environment. We still knew what the environment was. We still knew what the animations were. There are areas you learn just by working in the same space for a while that this scene, I'm not touching this yet because I know that it's going to get changed a lot. I think these themes are pretty nailed down, so I'm going to focus the team on getting these things done.
I won't leave you twisting in the wind. We're gonna need to draw her out of hiding, but you're gonna have to trust me.
The audio logs were, a great part of the game, and something that if you're a true fan, I mean, people really go in and listen to those and piece that all together. But I imagine there's a lot of work that goes into deciding, well, this is better for an audio log versus game dialogue, and there's the act of sort of cutting back and sort of saying, we need to be clear about what the narrative is for the game. What was that process like? I mean, the audio logs, were there things you added at the end, or were those, ideas that you had for the game, but then said, hey, maybe we'd demote these a little bit and make them audio logs?
As Sean was saying, there's sort of a hierarchy of expense that you have to face, and so any ideas you have to get across, especially as you start playing the game, you realize, well, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. You have to figure out how you can introduce that idea. And generally, as the train is moving, you try to think of cheaper and cheaper ways to get those ideas across. If it's less important, it goes to an audio log. If it's less important, it goes to a poster on the wall.
Well, there's also characters that you can bring in that have audio logs that aren't. Atlas, Tenenbaum, those are your big ones. You can bring in somebody to do a short, a few different audio logs. It's a character that some players may not even find, but it adds a little bit of depth to Rapture.
And it also, usually each character generally is about a certain idea, and we don't just sort of come up with characters, we have an idea problem that we need to solve, and so let's introduce a character who's this guy, and he will be the guy who sort of shepherds you through that idea.
Julie, my dear, I am trying to run a business here. You want to spend time with my honeybees? Well, I'm going to have to start charging you for the pleasure. If I come out one more time and find you lolling out there amongst my hives, I'm grabbing my shotgun. As to your question, yes, my days in beekeeping school are a blur, but I do seem to remember something about that enzyme you keep blabbing on about.
So as you're going through the game and, writing things, rewriting things, were there things with the original Bioshock that you've always been surprised that more people didn't pick up on, or was there something that, a connection to a character you thought was really going to resonate with people, which, didn't? Anything like that?
No, it's the opposite. I was amazed, I don't know how you felt, but I was amazed how many people connected to the Would You Kindly stuff. Because I think it was when I wrote that speech, I don't think anybody on the team was like, oh my God, this is really this or that. And I don't think I really had any sense that people were going to connect to it. I think we ended up sort of over time finding more ways to support the notion throughout the game.
Yep.
And I don't think I really, until I heard Pat put together the revelation moment, whereas where you had all the bits that Atlas had said to you in the past building up, and then there was a visual that went along with that. That's when I realized it was going to be a really powerful moment. But even so, I still did I think people were really going to connect to it or really even understand it? Because it's pretty out there. And that it was meta commentary, too. I think that completely, I think I thought, oh, it's kind of meta, cool. But people connected to it in a much bigger way.
Yeah, the choice to and everything, and also just, being able to kind of roll back and think of all those other moments throughout the game. And so, a great revelation like that, they're few and far between in games where you sort of then you want to play it again, you're just like, oh wow, really, that does all make sense, right?
Yeah, I think as a team, we were definitely proud of what we had done. But up till that point, SWAT 4 was the biggest game that we worked on, and we had no expectation of that anybody would pick this up. Or even Bioshock cosplay. I remember the first cosplay I saw with the guy in the Big Daddy suit, and his little daughter was in the kitchen cabinet. I think that was the first one I saw. I was like, whoa, people know this stuff. That's insane.
Yeah, people were building these outfits, and that only expanded with Infinite. I mean, that sort of went crazy with Infinite, with people cosplaying Elizabeth and Luteces and Booker. It meant a lot to people, and I don't think that's something we ever saw coming, and we're deeply grateful for it, because it's one thing to make a game and get good reviews and stuff like that. It's another thing to have things that people are having their weddings themed around it, and their tattoos and naming their children after characters. You can't plan for that, and I think the only way that could happen is if you just make something that you're deeply in love with and passionate about. I can say we were. It was something there's a lot of passion on the team about, but we didn't know people were going to take away what they did.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this?
Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Part of the challenge with that, though, is when people love fiction so much and they dive into every word written in every audio log and try and connect all the fiction, make sure it all makes sense. Are there any things from that game that you sort of look back and it's like, oh wow, like we didn't explain this and we should have, or things that fans have misinterpreted over the years?
There are things we think that we did that should have or shouldn't have been in the game. Like I was never a fan of having two endings, and I think
that's what the publisher was asking you to sort of have a.
That was the one thing that 2K, and they were very hands off. That was the one thing they insisted on, and it's not something I really thought was a good idea, because they're still limited, even though they're multiple. They're still limited, and so that was something that we ended up doing. One of the endings was far better than the other one. I mean, there's no. It's clear that I was much more interested in the happier ending with the little sisters than I was with the nuclear submarine ending.
I'm sure part of it was the idea that if this game is, if you're making a choice throughout it, I'm sure when some people are like, oh well, then it has to be a payoff, right?
Right. Except the game was really about lack of choice. About not being a choice. So that always struck me as a tension that was weird. But look, at the end of the day, they were putting up a lot of money, and so I can't really complain. They weren't dictatorial at all during the development. So that was the one thing. But that's a game that I wouldn't have put the boss battle in, the final boss battle. Like we seem to end up doing that over and over and over again. Every time we start a project, I'm like, I'm never going to do that again. We're never going to do that again, and we end up doing it.
Right.
We're not good at boss battles, and that you're fighting that guy, and look, this is the naked dude. It just doesn't work.
Totally makes sense.
And it works really pretty well up till then, but then it doesn't. It just doesn't work. That boss battle's silly.
From the moment you boot up Bioshock, you can feel the story grab hold of you. A plane crashes at sea, a mysterious lighthouse, a sprawling city beneath the ocean. Hooking the player from the first touch without overwhelming him with convoluted RPG mechanics was key to the success of the game and the skillful ramping up of Bioshock's legendary gameplay.
Bioshock has an amazing opening sequence that I can't imagine the game without it, with the plane and sort of the crash. But I understand that didn't come online until like the very end of development. Sean, is that true?
We had a couple of really depressing playtests. We had built all these systems. We thought we were doing a good job of like giving basically people a playground to play with and things to do. And when we had a playtest, we didn't realize how bad of a job we were doing in exposing those systems to the player, because we were so in these systems and in our own heads, we had no idea that we just weren't facing them towards the player at all. So after that playtest, we took a long, cold look at what we were doing and realized that we had to we were confident enough in the systems that they were going to be fun and meaningful to the player, but we really had to think about how we were going to introduce these systems to the player, and in such a way that they understand why the systems were there. Like, you can't ship a README file with the game and expect people to read it. Like, it has to be part of the experience. So the challenge is, how do you introduce people to these systems, but do it in such a way that it fits within the narrative? So we had to integrate all of these things into the story cleanly so that the player felt like it was one smooth experience. And I think the zap 'em and whack 'em thing was one of those.
And the 1-2 punch.
Yeah, the 1-2 punch that came out of that.
The plane sequence at the beginning, I heard a story that like a programmer put that together in like a day or two, and it was a very last minute thing, right?
It was. So we had done a focus test, and we had. It was one of the most depressing experiences of my life because we were very close to being finished, and it was basically giving people what essentially became the demo, and people played it, and it was in Boston, and we were sort of behind these glass windows, all these sort of Boston guys like, this is a wicked piece of shit. They hated it, and they were making fun of it, and they were saying, it's like watching some guys and dolls beating each other up, and it's the stupidest thing they've ever seen. And we thought we were in pretty good shape at that point. And I remember the focus test guy was like sort of like a doctor giving me the bad news. You know, sorry, Ken, you better get your affairs in order. Right. And we all came into work the next day, and we were like, what are we going to do? And we were all pretty depressed. But I think we started talking. And as we talked, we started thinking about what are they saying to us? What are these people saying to us? We think there's something there. How are they missing it? And we decided that maybe they didn't understand who they were and who their role as a character, who their role in the world was, because the game at that point started with you in the ocean, floating in the ocean after the plane crash. And
the crash still was in the fiction, it just wouldn't show it.
You just didn't see it, so you didn't have the voiceover saying, my parents always said I was going to do great things or whatever that. They didn't show the plane crash. We didn't establish a time period. Yeah. Because the plane is critical to establishing. You're smoking a cigarette. It's very 1960s looking. All that stuff was established. It wasn't established. So we decided we had no time and no money so we sort of came up with a script. I wrote some lines. A line, I think. Nate, one of our artists, recorded the line. Steven and Sean and those guys got to work on building this very simple sequence, which was relatively simple sequence, and then the plane crash actually happens over the Bioshock logo we already had, but we wrote a radio play behind that with altitude of the crash, and that I think set the emotional, and the people screaming in terror on the plane crash, that set the emotional tenor much better and explained who the player was, and all of a sudden we released. Then I think the next real encounter we had was people playing the demo, public encounter, and all of a sudden it was a very different experience.
No, I remember even back in the day, I think we did a thing on TV where you kind of talked about it, and it was like that night, and I remember that night, like people on the forums were just like going nuts. And even though the game had a lot of press attention, when people finally got to play it and go through that sequence, I just remember there was this mass sort of excitement around it, and then the game shipped only a few weeks after that, right, or a month after that?
A week later, or a few days later.
It's amazing, like now, to hear that, literally a month before the game came out, the plane sequence came online or something. I mean, it was that late. Right?
Well, we still had to go through certification and all that.
Yeah, so it's within,
It wasn't far. It wasn't far. It was really last minute, and it was one of those things where, you really shouldn't be putting in content that late. Yeah. But we felt we were so close to having something good that we just rolled the dice on it, and we worked really hard on it. We worked really hard. I remember how much time I spent on just that recorded of altitude. I could still hear the different version of that in my head. There's been so much time on that stuff, and these guys were working on getting the animations right and the
scene was shot in engine, but we decided to pre-render it so that we had to do less QA on it.
Right.
It wasn't going to be some weird streaming error or crash error. Wow. It was just we're just going to show the video,
And it's interesting because once you start in the ocean, we had this experience of testing a lot with the water effects and how beautiful Steven's water effects were. People didn't realize they were out of a cutscene at that point, and so they would just sit there and stare, and then they pick up the controller. And they pick up the controller, and all of a sudden they realize they were controlling things. But that, as Sean said, that part of the plane is not actually interactive. It was done in the engine, but we just filmed it.
Now, as people were playing through the game and you were testing it, I'm sure there was debate about, when would you introduce this plasmid, what would the ramp be? Did that change at all, sort of as you got towards the end of development, about we're going to give people the gun at this point, or it's we're going to trigger these plasmids at this point? How did that work?
So we moved guns around. For instance, there was a big debate about, originally you found a gun in the lighthouse, a pistol in the lighthouse.
Oh,
at the very
right
beginning.
there, yeah.
And because it's a shooter, right? What the hell? And we had a lot of debates about it, and I feel that it was important that we didn't do that, because the fact that you sort of go through a lot of the experience without having the distraction of a gun is important to getting you immersed in the world. Because when you have all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But you don't have the hammer, so you just sort of had to take in the world and have that feeling of fear. And like I know when you saw that splicer bounding around on the ceiling, that you couldn't do anything about it, and that had even though that's
those are those moments, right? Like I remember when I played Unreal for the first time, where it's like you're trapped and there's a monster and you can't do it, and the lights go out. It's like that's the moment with the splicer where you're like, I want to do something but I can't, and that evokes an emotion.
I remember we kept, moving where the machine gun appeared around and where various plasmids appeared around. It was a real. It's a real fine-tuning process.
Yeah, and it gave us an opportunity, like especially with the shotgun, to really present the weapons, like put some space between them.
It's a moment when you finally.
Yeah, I think
we get the shotgun Paul sequence.
Paul Hellquist was he put the sequence together for the when you see the shotgun laying in the pool of light. Like every game developer knows what that means. You know the minute you pick that thing up, something's going to happen. But it was still a very effective way, as I'm remembering it, to, oh look, I've been waiting for this thing, I'm going to pick it up, and now you have an immediate opportunity to use it. But at the same time, we're trying to ramp up the tension level by having the splicers kind of on the outside of the light, so you can't really see them, and then coming in one at a time and attacking you.
Yeah. And we had very few tools to really control how those splicers acted. So how they were set up and how the environment was lit was really important.
There's even other things like when you get the TK plasmid, I don't think we had a lot of physical space and opportunity and time to really present that. So we came up with the narrative that, it was the doctor's office and he used TK to practice tennis. And we had the turret in there that threw tennis balls at you. So if you wanted to, you could catch the tennis balls and throw them, and you could knock things down. I think it revealed pickups that you could then, pull to yourself with TK. But we're always trying to think of like little backstories that we could do. It doesn't have to be as involved as the shotgun ambush. Sometimes it's just, let's take a grenade turret and turn it into a tennis ball turret.
Because we want to, because I remember like the impulse was, I've been to dentist's office, and there's always some like weird aspect of the dentist personality. They always want to get through their office, They just have to have their hobby featured in some way. And so we saw an opportunity there to both feature this, he's a tennis nut, and teach TK at the same time.
And the
Rapture is overflowing with memorable locations and set pieces. In developing a world that feels organic, lived in, and functional, Irrational managed to create a space that feels perfectly suited to the story and action that takes place in it, which begs a question: did the plot shape the location, or did the plot fit squarely into a world that was already established?
Let's talk about some of the areas in Rapture, because it's an amazing place, but also it feels like there's certain areas that are very well designed, and that they have, a very certain aesthetic, and the characters in there, it all kind of comes together. Ken, do you have a part of Rapture that resonates the most with you still to this day?
I think the opening is always going to be the most important to me, because it's we spent a lot of time there, and it was all, for me as a challenge, as a narrative guy, is sort of how do we set up a very complex series of events and a very complex notion, and all this, Andrew, with so much to tell, Big Daddies and Little Sisters and Andrew Ryan and the time period, and do that all without cutscenes. And especially, I think, the descent to Rapture, when you get in the bathysphere, getting that right, getting everything right down to the bathysphere cresting the hill and seeing the city for the first time. Remember how much we worked on the timing of that, just getting that.
And it took us forever to figure out that we should just put the slide projector covering the window. Again, in hindsight, it seems like such an obvious choice, but we were really trying to figure out, how are we going to tell this story of Ryan, and then reveal, so you could see the city beyond the hill.
And also, we didn't have to show the whole transition going down the bottom of the ocean, because the whole screen was covered.
Spoiler alert.
I think that's the part that will always be near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, for me, it was Kashmir, That was one of the first...
The restaurant at the beginning.
Yeah, the restaurant at the beginning, because it was really like the first art box that we created that was Rapture. I mean, we created spaces before that weren't really hitting the Art Deco look. Scott Sinclair had just started, and he built that, designed and built that statue of the Atlas with the world on his shoulders that was in the middle of the room. And Mauricio had done some concept art for us of that space. And once we started putting everything together and getting it into Engine and actually walking around it and seeing those giant windows off to the side that just showed the seascape and really drove home the fact that you were underwater. It was the first time really all the elements started to come together.
And we actually we had built a bunch of stuff, and we actually stepped back and said, we have to just get one room right before we go any further, because we weren't getting it right. And so Mauricio did that concept drawing.
Yep.
We worked really hard on that statue, and that statue, I think, was the first object we really built in the game that was a Bioshock. So we just stayed in that room for like a month until we got it right.
And I think the original concept actually had a tram running through
it
it.
did.
So it was like even more complicated, and that was one of those things where we had to keep pulling back to really focus on what the bare essence of that room was.
Were there parts of Rapture that you never were able to realize that you sort of still missed? The zoo. People talked about Fort Frolic, right?
That I was excited about. Not everybody was excited about the zoo, but I don't know why I was excited about the zoo, because it would have been a nightmare. We had another area that was prior to Arcadia that was more of a straight up agriculture, forest type of area.
Before we had the bathyspheres, we had a whole sort of subway transport system in Rapture, which we spent a lot of time thinking about, and then just realized that these little submersibles would be a much more realistic and much better solution.
And you were going to be able to move between locations in that subway system?
Yeah, much like the bathyspheres, but they were much more integrated throughout the space, and we really want to support them. And we just realized it was not really relevant to what we were doing.
Were there certain locations or areas where you knew a certain narrative point, needed to happen? Like you look at, the reveal of sort of Atlas's true motivations. Like, was that like, oh, we've got to do it this level because it fits the story? Or was it more that you sort of like, you had the game laid out in a certain order and you just layered the story on top of it?
I think the big one I can think of is that you encounter Ryan in his sort of like, that he would live in an area of industry.
Okay.
So he lives in this very industrial area because that's where he would feel most comfortable. And that we wanted his office, his lair, to sort of be not in some, residential zone, but where he wants to wake up and smell the grease fires and, and the machines and the smoke. That's in his lifeblood. Industry is his lifeblood.
But it also had to be very theatrical. Like if you look at it now, it doesn't look like an office. You kind of know it's an office because the story is telling you that.
Set, yeah.
And we had some old technology that was laying around in the game that would control environment settings. So old system that we had would let you do high pressure, low pressure, medium pressure. And those would affect lighting and other like post-process things in the world. And that was a system that was cut, but because the code was in, we were always trying to figure out ways to use it. And one of the ways that we used it was in the Andrew Ryan sequence, because we didn't have a lot of narrative storytelling tools. We were basically switching the atmosphere to get all the lighting changes. So whenever a light changes in that scene, we're telling the game that the atmosphere is changing. And then the preset atmospheres come in and shine the spotlights on them or bring up the house lights when we need them to.
Because very, very early on, you could change the pressure in the areas, and that would change how explosions worked and all this stuff like that. And we just couldn't figure out how to make it gettable for the player. We couldn't make it feedback, but we still had all those. That moved a lot of levers in the game, so we still had the system. So we used it for the sort of theatrical cues of the, very theatrical cues of Ryan appearing, the lights going down where you are, and the lights coming up where he is, because the engine didn't have those tools by default.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
And there was a great sense of sort of artistic progression as you went through the game too, and that each level had its own sort of voice. Was that something that, you know, a lot of games as they move further in development, it's like, oh, we sort of ran out of time, we can, you know, it's like we're just going to sort of repeat this and change the color palette. It felt like, I mean, for the team, it was very defined from early on that you wanted each sort of level, which they were levels back in the day, to feel distinct?
Yeah, I mean, we had sort of experimented with that back on System Shock 2, back when every Doom level looked pretty much like every other Doom level, because they were just working on the same set of assets. We decided with our very rudimentary tools in System Shock 2 that we would progress with color, and every deck would feel different from a color standpoint, even though most of that was lighting, or textures, nothing really more. But we had the tools to actually, you know, sort of theme levels. I think a lot of this goes back to, I think my first memory was actually from when I was 1 year old at the Montreal World Expo.
Remember when you were 1?
Well, I remember being at something at this World's Fair, which I didn't realize I think was in 1967 when I was 1 year old, a little over 1 year old.
Wow.
And I was on a theme park ride they had and I remember being at this thing where a big bat flies out of this sort of thing and comes up. I don't know why I was a 1 year old was on this ride. I'm not sure, sort of a haunted housey kind of ride. And I remember loving it. And I think that stuck with me. So the notion of sort of theme parky themes and settings, and Disney World does a great job with this. You can go to Disney World, they theme areas. So themed areas are something that always resonated with me. And Bioshock sort of always has had this notion of feeling of theme in different areas, much more than the real world has. Like you walk from building to building, most of them you can't really tell them apart. You walk from walk from a floor of an office building to another floor. It's not going to look any different. But we always felt that was really important.
And it's also, I mean, if you look at SWAT 4, saw some early experiments with this, especially like the serial killer's house level in SWAT 4, which is probably one of the most dense levels that we ship. But you were trying to tell a specific story with that. And going straight into Bioshock and using the same exact engine that we're using, and we were very comfortable at that point with how the engine worked and how to art up these rooms, gave us a leg up when we sat down and really thought about what stories are we specifically trying to tell. And one of my favorite anecdotes from this time period is with Sander Cohen. I think it was Nate Wells and Stephen Alexander sat down one night, and they came up with a backstory for every dead body that you find in that space, and then they told that story with the props that they could. Even if it was just like, this guy crawled 3 feet and then shot himself in the head because he was sad about something, you know, they put those marks in, maybe put a picture next to the guy, and then he shot himself. So they really like did their homework and tried to add, you know, the backstory for everything that you're going to find in that space.
I've got Atlas's goons hitting us non-stop and 2 dead mechanics just this week. We need to control costs. If I wanted to deal with amateurs, I would have stayed on dry land.
Iconic and haunting, the Big Daddy and Little Sisters of Bioshock immediately captivated the public's imagination. Big Daddy encounters defined the Bioshock experience, creating new mechanics and techniques that had not been seen before in gaming. So Big Daddy, Little Sister, such an iconic moment or series of moments in this game. I'm fascinated about how that got layered in, because we talked a lot about the setting and the tone. That is still, to me, you know, a mechanic that I remember was very unique about, you know, choosing to engage the Big Daddy and being a fight that you know is going to be very aggressive and different than a, you know, traditional boss fight. I know you had an idea, Ken, of sort of 3 different types of AIs interacting in the same world.
Yeah, we were sort of like I was trying to think of like AIs you hadn't seen before, and this was still pretty early. Like 10 years ago, a lot's changed in 10 years. So like AIs were still pretty much enemies who saw you and came after you.
Zigzag, shoot.
Yep, and then that was really the focus: is how you make them, you know, AI better at you. You know, so I started thinking about, are there more primal behaviors to think about? And I was watching a nature show one day, you know, these typical nature shows, and it's like observe the mother tiger taking care of her young, you know, one of those kind of things. And I realized that we don't even need a narrator on those shows. We understand certain behaviors just by looking at them. They're very primal, like somebody protecting their young, the predator-prey behavior. Those things were you don't need dialogue for that. And AIs at that point we didn't have the ability to do a lot of sort of smart AI. Yeah. So I said, what if their behaviors are just very primal, and we can model those behaviors? So aggro rules is something we knew we can model, right? How does an AI aggro on you? What are the rules for that? Could they make a aggression display rather than just attack? And can another character appear afraid and hide behind the skirts of another character? And we started talking about these things, and the Big Daddy became very quickly, the actual form of the Big Daddy became very quickly as sort of this protector creature. The little sister took a lot longer, ironically, even though it's a much simpler notion in a lot of ways. The initial idea came out of sort of watching a nature show, and we're trying to work within our constraints of making, we couldn't make super complex AIs.
Because when we first got the system up and running, this is before the play test, we weren't really thinking about player facing these things. And we had this entire system set up that completely simulated what would happen. And you'd play through the vertical slice and you walk into a room and everybody's dead because the system would work perfectly. And you weren't there to see the fight. Yeah.
And we track they weren't called Little Sisters at the time, but we track how much they were harvesting, and it was all like a Command and Conquer level simulation.
Yeah.
And players didn't care or notice.
Yep.
And so we just abandoned all that stuff.
Yeah, so that took us a step towards, how do we present this to the player, then how do we make the gatherers, which we called them at the time before Little Sister design came on, like how do we make them empathetic towards the player, how do we make the player want to engage with that, because at the time they were just slugs.
Right.
So which is a horrible design.
Originally were slugs, right?
Yeah.
Not actually.
Which is a horrible design in so many ways because you don't care about slugs,
right.
and they're also on the ground, so you don't see them. They're not like at eye level, and they're dark. So.
But you still have the trailer had like the same, or not the trailer, the demo. Our prototype we did, so had the Big Daddy sort of like interacting with the little slug.
And slugs crawl around the Big Daddy?
No, it's this awful little mesh.
Right. Yeah.
It's like a little beetle, sort of.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
it was terrible.
Yeah,
and they were protecting.
And they had
protecting the beetles.
The beetles? What?
And,
really?
and
the
it
Big
was
Daddies
so
had two drills. They didn't have a hand, so there's no way they could like.
It's just fascinating because like the Little Sister, it's like there's such humanity in it, which you really connect with.
Which seems like
you would think that would be the obvious thing.
Yeah.
We're not very smart.
The idea of sort of choosing to engage the Big Daddy. I mean, when I was first time I played the game, I mean that was always profound to me because you sort of sit there and like, am I ready for this? And your choice to sort of like the kind of opposite of stealth, like when you want to be discovered. Was that always the mechanic with the Big Daddy?
Yeah, the idea was that they would have very particular rules about engaging with you that were entirely dependent on how the threat level towards, not them, towards their creature they were protecting.
Yeah, that was set, and then as you worked through it, I'm sure there were conversations about how difficult do we make these fights and sort of the balancing of that, and even, with the game, you don't start off with a Big Daddy fight. It's a little ways into the game until you actually get to that. So that was sure debated.
You actually encounter the notion of Big Daddy and Little Sister many times before you actually are freed into an arena where you can actually fight them. You see them
sneaking out, pipes.
You see them. You see them walking down a hall. The first time you see Little Sister, she's harvesting, and then you see the Big Daddy come and protect her. And we realized it was 4 or 5 sequences we had to do to set the stage for these characters. And look, we were hoping they'd be iconic and people would respond to the way they did, because we certainly spent energy on them with the expectation that they'd have an impact that we really just as easily could have turned out that nobody cared.
I think the actual very first time, and not a lot of people see it, there's a Little Sister in the vent in Kashmir restaurant. That if you're looking in the right direction at the right time, you'll see her looking at you, and then she'll disappear into the vent.
It's the eyes.
No, it's the actual mesh.
Is it the mesh?
Because it was easier to do that
right.
than new eyes, but yeah.
No! 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 Thank you.
The path of the righteous is not always easy.
The thing as you play through the game, I think the moments with those sort of encounters certainly stand out to the player. For you guys, as you were developing it, was there a debate about how often to sort of have those encounters? Like, like how many Big Daddies would there be? How would that play out? I mean, was that something that sort of changed as you?
No, I think we decided there would be 3. I think it was 3 per level.
So 3 and 2 in smaller levels. We did have a third Big Daddy that was mostly finished, but we couldn't make it fun. Like that last 10% of an AI is always like, where's the fun? Like, how do you really make it fun?
I think they put it into Bioshock too, didn't they?
They might have, yeah.
They might have, I don't know.
But, it was fully rigged, fully animated, but we just didn't have the time we needed to really, really polish it, so we ended up shipping with the Bouncer and Rosie.
Hunting the Big Daddy, that demo was a huge moment, I think, in the game's kind of marketing campaign. And that really, I think, sold the tension of that battle. When you showed that, did the entire game feel like that, or was that really more of just like a vertical slice of what you wanted the game to feel like?
That at that point was more what we wanted to feel like, because the Big Daddy had a lot of problems at that point. But we were confident we could do that. Like, we wanted to make sure that was an experience we could deliver on. And it was like it functioned, but it would do really weird things. Like, it had this tendency at the time to, if you did the wrong thing, that it would turn into basically a super ball and start like a tiny little super ball. The Big Daddy would go, turn to a super ball and start bouncing or off the ceiling and walls like a million miles an hour. Do you remember why you did that, or what was going on?
I'm sure it was some physics bug that we were,
And so that actually happened. Sometimes we were doing the demo, and Joe Falstick, who was the guy running the demo with me in Barcelona, was very good at making sure that he turned away from the Big Daddy. Like, oh yeah, I guess we killed the Big Daddy. He must be dying over there. But so all things were functional, but they weren't really. They didn't have all their bells and whistles on yet. It was really good for us because it sort of gave us some confidence that people would respond to just the notion of watching Little Sister and biding your time and choosing your moment.
Well, it gave us confidence, but it also gave us a tool that the development team as a whole could gather around and say, we want to make it like this. Like, yes, a lot of elements in that demo were scripted, but they provided a framework for us to go back and how do we make that so it's not scripted? How do we make this robust enough so that the player can actually use these systems?
Yep.
So it was something that we could point to and say, all right, how are we going to do this? Like, let's break it down and let's figure it out.
And that was like in September, and actually the game was done in February, March, so we weren't that far off.
Yeah.
A lot went into it in those final months. But it was a big confidence boost for us because we thought it was the most important thing about the game, besides the world, was this sort of Big Daddy, Little Sister concept. And if people didn't care about it, it would have been a problem for us because we spent a lot of time on it.
To harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the Bioshock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your Bioshock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay.
Part of Bioshock's lasting legacy, of course, are the Little Sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. Everyone became a water cooler conversation about, like, well, did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there were slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was.
Do you salt it? Do you not salt it?
Yeah. There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? The choice was, do I want to fight the Big Daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs. Right. Then we start seeing that opportunity there of, like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came out that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Do you want to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had a few, the press, and this sort of happens over and over again, the games press worried a ton about it and would wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose, that it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, you do sort of. They do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up. That we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing them. Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not? Right. And people would tell us stories how their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night. Right. And that's an interesting, that was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. This little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right, that has a voice actor connected to it who's an adult woman. And nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the curiosity of you're a gamer, so it's am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things? As you go through the game, it's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of push you up against the wall and say, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it. Because that's usually the way life is, right? It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, the two endings were, I don't know, I'm interested for narratively, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were free, you were given choice of the, once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about your slow descent into, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And that's what, I mean, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's 2 cutscenes with very tight time and economic constraints.
Or just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, positive or negative, because it is such a look. I think we really tried with Bioshock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It is really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to. Right. And how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. Right. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. How difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Right. Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? I mean, this is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving Little Sisters. Although, I have a few friends that were. I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I don't know if that was more, the game developer and them trying to see, what would happen, but certainly for the most part, I think most people. Which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. They kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the Little Sisters. So, yeah, I'll say it. The needle sways towards the green there.
Time for bye, Mr. B. Hurry, Mr. Bubbles.
hab keine Angst zu kämpfen!
Sie kam immer wieder zurück. Kennst du das Dankbarkeit?
Du hast die ganze Stunde. Das war ein schöner Engel, Mr. B. Ich sehe Adam, Mr. B. Adam sammeln ist toll. Es macht mich zu was ganz Besonderem. Das war ein schöner Engel, Mr. B. Danke, Mr. Bubbles. Bubbles, wenn die Sonne scheint. Bubbles.